Sometimes you think you know someone, and then one evening changes everything you believed about love, respect, and the person you thought would never hurt you. I had been dating Marco for 8 months, and everything seemed perfect until that one dinner invitation that would expose the ugliest truth about the man I thought I loved. What happened that night in his family's dining room still makes my heart race, but not for the reasons you might think. This is about the moment I discovered that sometimes the people closest to you can become your biggest betrayers, speaking poison right in front of your face, because they assume you cannot understand their native language. Before I dive into this story that changed my perspective on trust forever, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please hit that like button if you have ever felt underestimated by someone close to you. And do not forget to subscribe, because we are going to explore together how sometimes our greatest moments of empowerment come from the most unexpected betrayals. Trust me, you are going to want to hear how this dinner party took the most shocking turn imaginable. Meeting Marco felt like stepping into a romantic movie that I never wanted to end. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner, charming and attentive, with this way of making me feel like the most important person in any room. We met at a coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my linguistics degree, specializing in Romance languages. He was there with his laptop struggling with what looked like architectural blueprints, muttering under his breath in what I recognized as Italian. When I offered to help translate the technical terms he was having trouble with, he looked at me with such genuine surprise and gratitude that I felt an immediate connection. Those first few months were filled with long walks through the city weekend trips to little towns outside the metropolitan area and countless hours talking about our dreams and aspirations. Marco worked as a junior architect at a prestigious firm downtown, and he had this passionate way of describing buildings and spaces that made even the most ordinary structures sound like masterpieces. He would point out architectural details during our walks, explaining the history behind certain styles, and I found myself falling not just for him, but for the way he saw beauty in the constructed world around us. What I loved most about Marco was how he seemed to appreciate my academic pursuits. Unlike previous boyfriends who found my language studies boring or pretentious, he was genuinely interested in hearing about my research on linguistic preservation in immigrant communities. He would ask thoughtful questions about my coursework and even helped me practice presentations by listening to my research proposals. When I mentioned that I was fluent in Italian, having spent 2 summers studying in Florence during undergraduate school, he seemed impressed, but not particularly interested in exploring that connection further. The red flags were so subtle that I convinced myself they were just personality quirks rather than warning signs. Marco had this habit of switching topics whenever I brought up wanting to meet his family, always claiming they were too traditional and might not understand our relationship yet. He explained that his parents had very specific expectations about the women their son should date, and he wanted to make sure our relationship was solid before introducing that potential stress. At the time, this seemed considerate rather than manipulative. Another thing that should have concerned me was how Marco responded whenever he heard me speaking Italian with classmates or professors. Instead of joining the conversation or showing interest, he would become quiet and distant, almost uncomfortable. When I asked him about it, he brushed off my concerns, saying he preferred keeping his family language separate from our relationship for now. He claimed this was just his way of maintaining boundaries between different parts of his life, which seemed reasonable enough that I stopped questioning it. The invitation came on a Thursday evening in late October, delivered with an unusual amount of nervous energy that immediately put me on alert. Marco had picked me up from my evening seminar on medieval Italian literature, and instead of our usual comfortable conversation during the drive to my apartment, he seemed distracted and kept drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. When we reached my building, he turned off the engine, but made no move to get out, staring straight ahead through the windshield like he was preparing for a difficult conversation. Finally, he turned to me with this forced smile that did not quite reach his eyes and announced that his parents had been asking about me for weeks. According to Marco, they had grown curious about this mysterious girlfriend he had mentioned, but never brought around, and his mother had specifically requested that he invite me for Sunday dinner. The way he presented this information felt more like he was delivering bad news than sharing an exciting milestone in our relationship, which should have been my first major warning sign. When I expressed enthusiasm about finally meeting his family, Marco's reaction was surprisingly lukewarm. Instead of matching my excitement, he immediately began preparing me for what he described as their strong personalities and traditional expectations. He explained that his parents had immigrated from southern Italy 30 years ago and still maintained very old-fashioned ideas about relationships, family roles, and appropriate behavior for young women. According to Marco, they might seem judgmental or intrusive, but this was just their way of showing they cared about his well-being and future. The more Marco talked about his family, the more anxious he seemed to become about the upcoming dinner. He spent considerable time coaching me on topics to avoid including any mention of my previous relationships, my career ambitions beyond teaching, or my independent living situation. He suggested that I dress conservatively, speak softly, and focus on asking questions about his mother's cooking or his father's work, rather than talking about my own accomplishments. At the time, I interpreted these suggestions as helpful cultural guidance, rather than attempts to diminish my personality. What struck me as particularly odd was Marco's insistence that the dinner conversation would primarily be in English, despite his parents' comfort with their native language. He explained that they made an effort to speak English when entertaining guests as a way of being polite and inclusive. However, he warned me that they might occasionally slip into Italian during moments of excitement or emphasis, and I should just smile and nod until they remembered to translate. This warning felt unnecessary given my fluency, but I decided to follow his lead rather than complicate an already stressful situation. The week leading up to the dinner was filled with unusual tension that seemed to affect every aspect of our relationship. Marco became increasingly critical of small things that had never bothered him before, commenting on my clothing choices, my study habits, and even the way I organize my apartment. When I asked if he was having second thoughts about introducing me to his family, he insisted that he was just nervous about making sure everything went perfectly. He claimed that his parents' approval meant everything to him, and he wanted to present our relationship in the best possible light. Sunday evening arrived with an unseasonably cold wind that seemed to mirror my growing sense of unease about the dinner ahead. Marco picked me up at exactly 5:30, dressed in what appeared to be his most formal casual clothing, and the tension in his car was thick enough to cut with a knife. During the 20-minute drive to his parents' house, he reviewed his earlier instructions about appropriate conversation topics and reminded me once again that his family could be quite direct in their communication style. He seemed more nervous than I had ever seen him, which only served to increase my own anxiety about making a good first impression. The Romano family home was a beautiful two-story colonial in an established neighborhood with a well-maintained garden and warm lights glowing through every window. As we walked up the front steps, I could smell the amazing aromas of garlic herbs and what I recognized as braised meat floating through the evening air. Marco's mother, Isabella, greeted us at the door with enthusiastic hugs and immediate compliments on my appearance, speaking in lightly accented English that demonstrated both warmth and genuine effort to make me feel welcome. His father, Giuseppe, was more reserved, but equally polite, offering a firm handshake and asking about my drive over while taking our coats. The house interior was exactly what I had expected from Marco's descriptions. Comfortable furniture mixed with obvious Italian influences, family photographs covering every available surface, and the kind of lived-in warmth that only comes from decades of shared meals and celebrations. Everything about the initial welcome felt genuine and hospitable, which made what happened next even more shocking and hurtful. Dinner began beautifully with Isabella, proudly presenting a feast that included homemade pasta, perfectly seasoned chicken roasted vegetables, and fresh bread that filled the dining room with incredible aromas. The conversation flowed easily in English, covering safe topics like my studies, Marco's work projects, and the upcoming holiday season. Giuseppe asked thoughtful questions about my academic interests, and Isabella insisted on serving me generous portions while sharing stories about her own experiences, adapting to American culture after immigrating. However, about halfway through the main course, something shifted in the family dynamics that I initially attributed to the wine and comfortable atmosphere. Marco's parents began incorporating Italian phrases into their conversation, which gradually evolved into longer exchanges in their native language. At first, these conversations seemed innocent enough, focusing on cooking techniques and family updates, that I assumed were not particularly relevant to me as a guest. But then I started recognizing certain words and phrases that made my stomach drop, with the horrifying realization of what was actually happening. They were not just speaking Italian. They were speaking Italian specifically about me, and none of what they were saying was complimentary. Isabella made comments about my appearance that roughly translated to observations about my obvious inexperience with proper feminine presentation. Giuseppe questioned my suitability as a potential daughter-in-law, expressing concerns about my educational focus and what he saw as concerning signs of independence. The conversation that unfolded in Italian over the next hour was like watching my entire relationship crumble in real time, except the people destroying it thought I was too ignorant to understand what was happening. Marco not only participated in these discussions about my shortcomings, but he actually initiated many of the most hurtful comments. When his mother questioned whether I had the domestic skills necessary to support a family, Marco laughed and assured her that I was probably too focused on my books to learn practical household management. The betrayal deepened when Marco began sharing private details about our relationship that he had no right to discuss with anyone, let alone his parents. He told them about my student loan debt, describing it as a financial burden that any serious suitor would need to consider carefully. He mentioned that I had never expressed interest in having children, presenting this as evidence of selfish priorities, rather than personal choice. Most painfully, he shared intimate details about our physical relationship, reducing our most private moments to crude jokes that made his father chuckle and his mother shake her head in disapproval. As the Italian conversation continued, I realized that this dinner was not about his parents getting to know me, but rather about Marco demonstrating his ability to maintain control over a relationship while keeping his family entertained. Every compliment he had given me in English was contradicted by dismissive comments in Italian. When he told his parents in English that I was intelligent and ambitious, he immediately followed up in Italian by suggesting that I was probably too naive to understand how relationships actually work in the real world. The most devastating moment came when Isabella asked Marco directly if he thought I was marriage material, and he responded with a lengthy explanation about how I was fine for now, but obviously not someone he could see as a long-term partner. He described me as a temporary distraction, while he figured out what he actually wanted in life: someone pleasant enough to date, but lacking the qualities his family would expect in a wife. According to Marco, I was too American in my thinking, too independent in my lifestyle, and too focused on my own goals to successfully integrate into their family traditions. What made this betrayal even more painful was watching Marco's parents nod along with these assessments, occasionally adding their own observations about my obvious flaws and limitations. They discussed my clothing choices, my conversation style, my educational background, and my apparent lack of traditional feminine qualities, with the casual cruelty of people who believed their target could not understand their words. Isabella even suggested that Marco should consider ending our relationship before I developed deeper feelings and became more difficult to discard. Throughout this entire character assassination, conducted in a language they assumed I did not understand, Marco maintained his caring boyfriend facade in English. He continued serving me food, asking if I needed anything, and making surface-level conversation about neutral topics. The cognitive dissonance of experiencing his tenderness in one language while hearing his cruelty in another created a surreal nightmare that I will never forget. As the dinner wound down and Isabella began clearing dishes, while still making disparaging comments about my obvious unfitness for their family, I made the decision that would define the rest of my life. Instead of confronting them immediately or leaving in tears, I chose to wait for the perfect moment to reveal that I had understood every single word they had spoken. When Giuseppe suggested that Marco should find himself a nice Italian girl who understood traditional values, I knew the time had come to show them exactly how much this supposedly ignorant American had comprehended. I stood up slowly, smoothed my skirt, and turned to face Isabella with the brightest smile I could manage. In perfect fluent Italian, with the proper regional accent I had learned during my time in Florence, I thanked her for the absolutely enlightening evening and the delicious meal. The look of shock that crossed her face was immediately followed by the horrifying realization of what my linguistic abilities meant for everything they had said throughout the dinner. Continuing in Italian, I told Giuseppe how fascinating it had been to learn his true opinions about American women and their supposed inadequacies as partners for Italian men. I mentioned that as someone who had spent considerable time studying in Italy and had written her thesis on the evolution of regional dialects, I found his particular word choices quite revealing about his character and upbringing. The color drained from his face as he realized that every crude comment and dismissive observation had been completely understood. But I was not finished. Turning back to Marco, I addressed him in the same fluent Italian, expressing my gratitude for the educational experience of seeing exactly who he truly was when he thought nobody was watching. I told him that while I had believed we were building something real together, it was now clear that he saw me as nothing more than temporary entertainment while he searched for someone worthy of his family's approval. Then I began systematically addressing every lie he had told his parents about me during our relationship. I corrected his false claims about my debt situation, explaining that I had received full funding for my graduate studies and actually had a better financial foundation than most people my age. I clarified my career goals, describing the international consulting opportunities available to someone with my linguistic skills and academic background. Most importantly, I addressed his misrepresentations about my character and values, explaining that independence and intelligence were not flaws to be ashamed of, but strengths to be celebrated. The silence that followed my revelation was absolutely deafening. Isabella stood frozen with a serving dish in her hands. Giuseppe stared at his wine glass like it might provide some escape from this nightmare, and Marco looked like he was desperately searching for words that might somehow undo the damage of the last 3 hours. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely, and for the first time all evening, I felt like I was in control of my own narrative. In English, I thanked them again for their hospitality and told them that while the meal had been excellent, I had learned everything I needed to know about their family and would not be returning. I gathered my purse and coat, walked calmly to the front door, and left 3 people sitting in stunned silence around a dining room table covered with the remnants of what should have been a celebration, but had instead become an exposure of their true characters. The 20-minute walk to the nearest bus stop in the cold October wind was one of the most empowering experiences of my life. With every step away from that house, I felt lighter and more confident in my decision to trust my instincts and stand up for my own dignity. By the time I reached my apartment, I had already blocked Marco's number and begun mentally preparing for the conversation I would have with mutual friends about why our relationship had ended so abruptly. Marco tried calling dozens of times over the following days, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails that ranged from attempts at explanation to outright begging for another chance. I never responded to any of these communications because there was simply nothing left to discuss. Someone who could betray trust so completely while maintaining a facade of caring was not someone I could ever feel safe with again. The experience taught me that fluency in multiple languages is about more than academic achievement or career opportunities. Sometimes it becomes the tool that reveals the true nature of people who think they can hide behind linguistic barriers. More importantly, I learned that self-respect means walking away from situations where your worth is diminished, regardless of how much you might have invested in the relationship. 6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that Marco was engaged to a young woman from his neighborhood whose family had known his family for years. According to the reports, it was exactly the kind of traditional arrangement his parents had always envisioned for him. I felt no jealousy or regret about this development, only genuine pity for someone who would never experience the growth that comes from being truly known and accepted by a partner. Looking back on that dinner, I realized it was not really about Marco's family accepting or rejecting me. It was about my own journey toward understanding what I deserved in a relationship and finding the courage to demand nothing less than complete honesty and respect. The woman I was before that evening might have tried to fix the situation or convince myself that the betrayal was somehow my fault, but the woman I became afterward knew better than to accept anything less than authentic love. That night changed my approach to relationships forever, teaching me to pay attention to the consistency between people's words and actions across all situations. It also reinforced my belief that education and self-improvement are never wasted investments, even when they lead to uncomfortable truths about people we thought we could trust. Today, I am in a relationship with someone who celebrates my intelligence, supports my ambitions, and speaks about me with the same respect in private that he shows in public. The difference between genuine love and performed affection is something you can only recognize once you have experienced both. And I am grateful for the painful lesson that taught me to never settle for less than authentic partnership again. What experiences have taught you the most about recognizing genuine respect versus perform politeness in your relationships? Share your thoughts in the comments below because I would love to hear how others have navigated similar situations where someone's true character was revealed in unexpected ways. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of your own experiences with betrayal and empowerment, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about finding strength in difficult situations. Do not forget to share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing about the importance of trusting your instincts and standing up for your own worth. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the most painful experiences become the foundation for the most important growth in our lives.